Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. At the recent G20 summit, the Australian Prime Minister said the thing about G20 that it's large enough to be representative and small enough to be effective. These are Tony Abbott's words of shirt-fronting fame. What is the value of G20? To CrossTalk, the G20 Summit, I'm joined by my guest, Michael Hudson in New York. He is an author and economics professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. In Washington, we have Colin Bradford. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a former chief economist at the U.S. Agency for International Development. And in London, we cross to John Weeks. He is an author as well as professor emeritus of development economics at the University of London. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Okay, Michael, I'd like to go to you first in New York. We had just finished G20, and right before that, there was APEC. Very different venues, very different outcomes. What's your take from the two meetings?
Well, what's different above all is the press coverage. The American and British coverage has only been on the G20 in Australia, but the coverage in Russia, Germany, and China has all been on the APEC meeting, and that's because the APEC meeting sort of left President Obama as the odd man out, and there were substantive agreements there as to how to integrate the Russian economy with China and Iran and other economies. Nothing much was done at the G20 meetings at all, certainly officially. Apparently, according to the press conferences, the only real work happened in bilateral meetings, very largely between President Putin and Angela Merkel. And at issue were what was not discussed at the meetings once, and that was Ukraine. And while it looks like what happened there is that instead of the United States using Ukraine as a lever to drive Russia away from Europe, this is backfiring now. And Germany and the other countries are protesting against the sanctions that NATO is forcing them to put. And it looks like America is actually may end up driving Europe together with Russia, just the opposite of what the neocons are trying to do.
Okay, Colin, in Washington, how do you read what happened in Australia and right before in Beijing? Because, you know, when you think of the G20, it started because of a very important crisis in 2008, and I think most of us would commend what was done there. At least it stopped the crisis or started slowing it down. But ever since then, what has it really accomplished? And can it accomplish much?
Right. I think what people overlook in these summits is the degree to which there is a work program underneath of the leaders' meeting, which is driven by the leaders themselves. In other words, the work program of ministers of finance, central bank presidents, ministers of employment, even ministers of environment, ministers of foreign affairs, and ministries of those various sectors is driven by the fact that the preparations for the summits and the aftermath of them. And that's a non-trivial event. In other words, the leaders' meetings are important for what they say among each other, some of which gets out to the media, some of which does not. And they're important in the sense that they're action-forcing events and pushes the agenda higher. The Australians did a good job of getting a commitment to incrementally increase global growth by 2018 by 2 percentage points by trying to close the gap between what is called the potential rate of growth and the actual rate of growth. And so I think, and some important things happened in infrastructure and other issues in Brisbane. But to see the real relevance to people's lives and to the way governments work is you now have 20 of the most important governments in the world cooperating across a host of issues on great detail week after week, month after month. And I think that you have to see that underneath the surface of the water, not just the tip of the iceberg.
Okay, John, if I can go to you in London, what are the commonalities? Because in 2008, the whole world didn't need the entire financial system to collapse, and they worked together. But if you look at the economy since then, growth is in one part of the world, and that's not the West. So the growth is someplace outside of the West, and the debt is all in the West. These are not commonalities. These are big differences. John in London.
Yes, I want to begin by saying what I think links the two meetings together, and that is the relative decline of U.S. power. The United States government no longer has a determining role to play in Asia. So as a result, it was on the margin. Once it got to Australia, it was with many of its, buddies, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and it could appear to playing an important role. But I think its weakness was shown by bringing up the issue of Ukraine. And there's a backstory there. Why is Ukraine in such a mess? I would say very essential to that is the structural adjustment programs which the U.S. supported in the early 1990s. But that's getting slightly off the subject. So I think that what we saw is a relative decline of U.S. power in real time, you might say. And in China, the meeting in Beijing, I mean, China is a regional power and becoming a global power, challenging the United States. And that's what I think those two meetings were about.
Okay, Michael, in New York, obviously Ukraine dominated during the G20 meeting, but it seems to me it should have been counterintuitive that you have some major players right there. They could have sat down and tried to solve the problem. Because anyone in their right mind that knows anything about this crisis, and people can have their opinion, that's fine. But Russia is instrumental in helping solve that economic catastrophe called Ukraine. But Obama and his buddies don't have any interest in that, do they?
Well, as you just pointed out a minute ago, there isn't any commonality precisely because of this. Europe is going on an austerity program. The United States also is pressing for austerity, whereas Russia and China are trying to revive Russian industry and develop their industry. So you have these two groups that are going in different directions. Again, Ukraine wasn't officially discussed at the meeting at all in the official reports of the meeting. Everything was done bilaterally, and that's because the United States and England refused to talk about the Ukraine. They refused to answer any of the questions, and so all of the real reporting came in President Putin's press conference afterwards, where he said, look, what you're having now is Ukraine is absolutely broke. It can't afford to buy coal. It ordered coal and can't pay for it. It's bombed the electric companies and the coal in the eastern Ukraine. It can't pay, and what's going to happen? And he pointed out that the United States itself, in the case of Kosovo, has said, well, when a region is under ethnic attack, it has the right to vote and have self-determination. That's the basic principle of the United Nations, and as long as the United States, England, and the NATO oppose this, there's nothing to talk about, and if they did talk about it, it would make the conflict so clear that at these meetings, they don't want conflict. That means they don't want to talk about anything really substantive, and that's why these meetings for the last few years, since 2008, really haven't accomplished very much at all, except to help the politicians in their own home countries have a chance to go abroad and shake hands with foreign leaders, which is only
Peter,
superficial.
I want to go back to.
Okay, go ahead, jump in there in
Washington,
Washington,
go back to
please.
the APEC.
Please do.
Yeah, I want to go back to the APEC meeting in Beijing, because I think if we don't have aren't on the same page about that, you can't see the rest of what happened during the course of that week. The APEC meeting was primarily about economics. In fact, at least from what we picked up in the U.S., Russia is certainly an important part of APEC. Russia's relationship with Asia is as important as the U.S. relationship with Asia. So it wasn't that Russia was marginalized, but the focus there was on the differences in views between China and the U.S. about trade. The Chinese government had, going into the meeting, a view of a wider free trade area in Asia called FTAP, which played against the U.S. position, which is a trans-Pacific partnership in trade, which includes 12 countries, but does not, I think, regrettably, include China.
Well, it excludes China.
They solved.
It excludes China. Let's be clear
there. It excludes China, which is wrong. Which, in my view, is wrong. But never mind. You have these two, what you could say going into the meeting were conflicting visions. So what did they do? They sequenced they affirmed both, and they sequenced them in saying that the TPP, the U.S. trade pact would come first, and that the FTAP would come, the Chinese version of the wider arrangement. It would be a TPP would be a stepping stone to FTAP, the Chinese version. And so they mollified the degree to which these were conflicting views and made them complementary by sequencing them. So that was the first thing. The second thing is that the U.S. and China reached an agreement on climate change. And third, they started discussions on an investment accords. And third, they made changes in visa arrangements, which facilitates the movement of students and businessmen. So, and you had President Xi Jinping and President Barack Obama having dinner together alone one evening while they were in China. So this hardly looks like, this looks like a toning down and a sort of more mature realignment of the relationship between the U.S. and China.
Okay, let me go to Michael real quick. Let me go to Michael real quick before we go to the break. Go ahead, jump in. Go ahead, Michael.
Peter, the division is actually much larger. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is really to dismantle government and make it impossible for any government to tax environmental pollution or to regulate industry. And it's the diametric opposite of China's ideal of a mixed economy, which used to be America's ideal and Western Europe's ideal. So there's no way that you can have one, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, leading to another. There are two different views of what direction society and indeed civilization should go into.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the G20. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the recent G20 summit and its outcomes. Okay, I'd like to go back to John in London. John, I saw your face. You really wanted to jump in right at the break here. Go ahead right now. Please do.
Okay, I would make 2 points. One is that the discussion between the United States and China, I mean, I think we have to be realistic. We're between an unabashed dictatorship and a dysfunctional democracy. So what did the agreement on climate change amount to? I think it's a toss-up as to which side was the more cynical. Obama knew that Congress will not appropriate a cent for any agreement he reached. And on the Chinese side, they made no concrete commitment to stop building any of their new coal plants. So therefore, I think you have to take that quite with a grain of salt. Second, I would I would reiterate the point that Michael made about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is not really about trade. It's about facilitating investment by stronger countries in the economies of weaker countries, and in some cases, as was mentioned, a privatization process. So it's not about free trade, whatever that misnomer may mean. It's about countries trying to establish spheres of influence, and that's basically the difference between the Chinese plan and the U.S. plan.
Okay, Colin in Washington, you like to react to that there? It's not about free trade at all.
No, for sure, underneath it all is geopolitical positioning. But to tell you the truth, the way it was seen, at least from Washington, and I admit there are different journalistic prisms that we're all looking at this through. That's clear from the discussion we've had so far. But the fact of the matter is that from the way it looked in Washington, Obama coming off the heels of an electoral defeat, which is typical for this part of the cycle in American history, but still goes to Asia. And in fact, it looked from this end that there was a realignment in the relationship between the two leaders themselves and between the two countries in the way they were dealing with these problems. Because these two issues specifically, well, the trade, the climate change, the investment, and the visa issues, none of which could have been done on the spot, all of which took months to work through, were a realignment in terms of the way that the two countries are working together, trying to minimalize the differences and maximize the complementarities. And I just think that's a fact of what happened. You are not going to diminish through any kind of journalistic spinning the fact that the United States has been, is today, and will continue to be a major power in Asia. China knows that. The U.S. knows that China is a rising power in Asia. The U.S. knows that Russia is an important in the global economy. And it's a question of using these mechanisms, APEC and the G20, to engage mature conversations about differences so that we can move the common agenda forward despite them.
Okay, Michael in New York, you want to react to that? There, go ahead.
There isn't any common. There is no common agenda. There is, as you see in Ukraine, there is an absolute antithesis of how countries should develop. Will there be a mixed economy, as there is in China, and as Russia now is going to have to use state power to redevelop the industry that was destroyed? Or are we going to have a neoliberal economy that has really put the class war back in business, as Europe is doing, and force austerity? The European countries that attended say, wait a minute, on the one hand, our businessmen are very glad that we're keeping wages down. On the other hand, now they're finding that we've kept wages so far down, there's no internal market. The only place we have to turn is Russia, China, and the BRICS. And the United States is trying to say, don't trade with Russia, let's you and Russia fight. And the U.S. is trying to prevent them from this. So there's no compromise. There is an antithesis at work. And as long as that's the case, and Obama will not even talk really to Putin except to say something that the American press can quote, Obama's talking to the journalists, and the other leaders of APEC are talking about economics. And I, by the way, am not a journalist. I'm an economist. And I can assure you that Wall Street's looking at the economics of the situation. They're ignoring the journalistic spin because there isn't any spin. It's just a monotone here.
Okay, John, that's an interesting...
No, there is a common agenda.
Okay, Colin,
go ahead. There is a common agenda. There's a common global economy, and there's a common environment.
I wanted to follow up on one last...
in climate change.
Okay, let's go to London. Go ahead, London. John.
I wanted to follow up on something Michael said. I think that a missing element we need to mention, you might say the cliche in the room, is Germany. Germany is the German government is extremely powerful. It has the largest trade surplus in the world in most years. When it's not China, it's Germany, and it is dominating continental Europe through an austerity program, as was mentioned. And it plays a major role with regard to pressure on the Ukraine. I think the German government has recognized that nothing can be done about however you define what the Russian government is doing in Ukraine. There's nothing that the Europeans can do about it. So you might as well just keep your mouth shut. And I think that's a position that Merkel is increasingly taking.
No.
Now,
wait a minute.
I think
There's a very interesting development that happened today, which is quite interesting, and it came out in the New York Times this morning, is that President Putin got back to Germany, to Russia in time to appear on German television on Sunday night in prime time to discuss his views of the Ukraine. And he laid out, as I understand it, his legal reasons for taking the positions and making the actions that he has done there. And Angela Merkel stayed in Australia to address Parliament on Monday and give a talk at the Lowy Institute, a think tank in Sydney, yesterday, in which she made clear her deepest concerns about the actions in Ukraine, hinted at the fact that you couldn't take military action off the table, which was a new assertion from her. So what you have is these two leaders who were together in Brisbane and could have talked about this in Brisbane, going back to back to their domestic audiences by President Putin giving a TV show in Germany, and Angela Merkel giving a talk in Australia, talking to her domestic publics, when in fact the point of the G20 is bringing together countries with different views about major problems and having them sit down together and talk through these issues.
Okay.
So that's
all right.
That's the way it should have happened.
Okay, Michael. But okay. Everyone, I keep trying to talk about G20 and APEC, but everybody wants to talk about Ukraine. That's fine. I've done about 100 programs on Ukraine. So let me go to Michael here. I mean, all of the pressure the media was pushing against Putin. Putin's alone, Russia's isolated, all the cliches. It's ridiculous. But it's not working. It's not working at all. And so all of these leaders, from Harper to Abbott, all these guys just made a fool out of themselves talking about an issue they don't know anything about whatsoever, and nothing has changed. As a matter of fact, if anything, if you look at the interview that Putin made, his position is very, very clear. It's very, very rigid, and there is no compromise. The West screwed up Ukraine. It's time for you guys to start taking care of it. Go ahead, Michael.
That's quite right. The longest discussion bilaterally at the conference was indeed between Putin and Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel made a decision. She's not going to support German industry. She's not going to support German people. She's not going to support her own party. She's supporting the United States. And this has led in Germany to a huge anti-Merkel wave. All the phone calls I'm getting from Germany, they're now saying, my God, what is this crazy lady doing? She thinks she's part of NATO. She thinks she's Hillary Clinton and wants to be a general. So Merkel has just committed political suicide by her nutty talk before the Australian Congress. And this has enormously strengthened the sympathy by German business, by German voters, by French voters, by French farmers, by Italian workers, all for Russia. They're thinking, my God, the United States is pushing our leaders into a crazy position that every poll shows that we as voters oppose. How can this be? Is this a kind of a dictatorship or what?
Gentlemen, I want to ask,
European politics is being torn.
I want to ask everybody, all three of you, one question, because we're rapidly running out of time. And I want to go to Washington first. Colin, is there such a thing as G2 still on the horizon? People used to talk about it a lot. I don't hear it too much now. G2.
Well, the advantage, yes, of course, is a G2 in a way, because these are the two economies that are the largest in the world. And there's an increasingly serious political dialogue between the two countries, as we can see. But the advantage, it's always seemed to me, of having the G2 embedded in the G20 is precisely that you have a conversation about the global agenda issues with other countries of significance and clout in the room who represent essentially the stake that everyone else has in how the U.S. and China sort themselves out. So yes, there is a G2, but it's emerging at precisely the moment that the G20 has come to the fore as the premier forum for the discussion of economic and other issues, because recall Syria was talked about in St. Petersburg.
We got one more minute, and I want to have 30 seconds for Michael and 30 seconds for John. Go ahead, Michael. Go ahead.
Peter, what you call the G2 is really the G1. It's America talking to itself. You can't have America go to a meeting with China, talk to itself, where the president will give a speech that the U.S. press will report, and then not report what the other side does. That's called a dialogue of the deaf. So there really isn't a G2 in principle, because the other side isn't listening.
Let me go to John. Last word goes to John. 30 seconds in London. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's a G2 because I don't think that the Chinese and the U.S. are really, governments are really interested in sorting things out. They're involved in a rivalry. I wish I hope Peter's optimism holds, but I don't think it is. I think we're entering in a new period of global tension and global conflict between an emerging superpower and existing superpower. And I think that that should worry everybody in the United States and Europe and China and everywhere.
All right, gentlemen, on that note, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in New York, Washington, and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules. I love you.